It wasn't a road, and it had almost nothing to do with silk. For 15 centuries, the Silk Road connected China to Rome through 6,000 kilometers of deserts, mountain passes, and hidden trails. But here's what most people get wrong. It wasn't a single route that merchants traveled end to end. It was a network, a system. And along those paths moved not just silk and spices, but religions, languages, inventions, diseases, and ideas that reshaped entire civilizations. The empire that controlled this network controlled the world. I'm here at Object Origins, where we explore the history of things and the systems that moved them across continents. Today, we're looking at the Silk Road not as a historical curiosity, but as the first internet. We're going to trace how this network actually worked, what really traveled along it, and why it mattered so much that empires went to war to control it. By the end, you'll see why a merchant in Samarkand in the year 1200 was living in a more connected world than most people realize. Here's something that catches people off guard. The term Silk Road didn't exist until 1877. A German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen invented it. The merchants, emperors, and traders who actually used these routes for over 1,000 years never called it that. They didn't need a name for it, they lived inside it. It was just the way goods moved, the way ideas traveled, the way the world worked. But the name stuck because it captures something true. Silk was the prestige commodity. Chinese silk was so valuable in Rome that it was literally worth its weight in gold. Emperors wore it. Wealthy Romans would pay fortunes for a single bolt. That's why Richthofen chose the name. But if he'd been honest about what actually moved along these routes, he might have called it something else entirely. Because here's what's fascinating. Silk was just one item among dozens.
Spices from India, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, traveled west and became so valuable they literally funded European exploration centuries later. Paper and printing technology moved from China westward, transforming how knowledge was recorded and shared. Gunpowder traveled the same routes. So did glass, jade, ceramics, and gold. Horses moved east. Slaves moved in multiple directions. Textiles, furs, amber, the list goes on. But the most important things that moved along the Silk Road weren't objects at all. Buddhism traveled from India into China along these routes, reshaping Chinese civilization. Islam spread from Arabia into Central Asia and beyond. Nestorian Christianity, a branch of Christianity that most Westerners have never heard of, reached China. Languages mixed, technologies transferred, artistic styles blended. A merchant in Samarkand in the 1300s would have encountered Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and Zoroastrians all in the same marketplace. The Silk Road wasn't just a trade route, it was a cultural crossroads. And that's where the real story gets complicated. Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, these weren't random desert towns. They became some of the greatest cities in the world because of where they sat on the network. Samarkand, in particular, became so wealthy and cosmopolitan that it rivaled Baghdad and Constantinople. Why? Because it was a hub. Merchants couldn't cross the entire Silk Road in one journey. The deserts were too vast, the mountains too high. So they stopped at these cities. They traded, they rested, they bought and sold goods to other merchants heading in different directions. These cities developed caravanserais, essentially hotels for merchants and their goods. Massive structures with courtyards, storage rooms, and stables. They became centers of commerce, culture, and information exchange. A merchant arriving in Kashgar from China would learn about prices in Baghdad. A trader from Persia would hear about demand in Rome.
Information flowed as much as goods did. But here's the thing, these cities were also vulnerable. They depended entirely on the network staying open, on trade routes remaining safe. And for most of the Silk Road's history, that wasn't guaranteed. Bandits, wars, and political instability constantly threatened the routes. Merchants traveled in armed caravans. Entire expeditions could be wiped out. Then, something changed. In the 13th century, Genghis Khan unified the Mongol Empire, and for the first time in history, the entire Silk Road network fell under a single political authority. This period, called the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace, was the golden age of the Silk Road. Trade exploded. Merchants could travel with confidence. The Mongols, despite their reputation for conquest, were actually pragmatic about commerce. They understood that trade generated wealth, and wealth meant power. During this period, the Silk Road reached its peak. Goods moved faster, more merchants traveled. Cities like Samarkand became even wealthier. And crucially, information moved faster too. Innovations spread more quickly, technologies transferred more efficiently. The world became more connected than it had been in centuries. But the Pax Mongolica didn't last forever. By the 15th century, the Mongol Empire had fragmented, and something else happened that would change everything. Ocean routes. European explorers figured out how to sail around Africa to reach Asia. Suddenly, the overland Silk Road wasn't the only way to move goods between East and West anymore. It was slower, more expensive, less reliable. The network that had connected the world for 15 centuries began to fade. Before we move on, there's something darker worth mentioning. The Silk Road didn't just move goods and ideas. It also moved disease. The Black Death, the plague that killed roughly a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, traveled along these same routes from Central Asia westward.
It arrived in Europe in 1347, carried by merchants and traders. The same network that had spread Buddhism and Islam and innovations also spread one of history's deadliest pandemics. Connection cuts both ways. Here's where it gets interesting for today. The traditional Silk Road faded, but the idea behind it never disappeared. In 2013, China launched the Belt and Road Initiative, an enormous infrastructure project designed to recreate the Silk Road for the 21st century. New roads, new railways, new ports. The goal is explicitly to reconnect Asia, Europe, and Africa through trade networks. It's the Silk Road reimagined for the modern world. And that's the real insight. The Silk Road wasn't just a historical artifact. It was a template, a proof of concept. It showed that when you connect distant regions through trade, you create wealth, cultural exchange, and innovation. You also create vulnerability and the potential for disease and conflict. But the fundamental principle that connection matters remains true. The Silk Road was the first internet, not because it used technology, but because it did what the internet does. It connected people who would never have met otherwise. It moved information as much as goods. It created hubs of innovation and culture. And it showed that the world has always been more connected than we assume. Every object we've covered on this channel, the silk, the spices, the paper, the porcelain, moved along this network. The Silk Road history is the history of how the world became one. If this gave you a new way of thinking about how civilizations connect, subscribe. I go deep on ancient trade routes and the objects that shaped empires every week. Leave a like if this one hit different. There's more on the channel that picks up where this leaves off.